There's a kind of childhood that doesn't look like anything from the outside. No bruises, no shouting, no dramatic moments that make it into the stories people tell later. Just a child in a room, and the adults in that room are busy, or tired, or somewhere else in their heads. And the child learns, slowly and completely, that their presence doesn't change anything, that they could be there or not there, and the room would feel exactly the same. That child learned something, and what they learned followed them out of that room and into every room they have ever walked into since. This video is about that child and about what happens to them when they grow up. Let's start with what being ignored actually does to a developing brain, because it isn't nothing. In fact, the research is striking. Neuroscientists studying early childhood development have found that emotional neglect, being consistently unseen and unresponded to, activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. A child's brain does not distinguish between being hurt and being ignored. Both register as threat. Both demand a response from the nervous system. Both leave marks. Psychologist Martin Teicher at Harvard has spent years studying how early neglect affects brain development. His research found that children who experienced emotional neglect show measurable differences in the structure and function of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, decision-making, and sense of self. The ignored child's brain literally develops differently. Not permanently, not irreversibly, but differently. And those differences shape how that child experiences the world for years, sometimes decades afterward. Here's what that looks like in practice. The child who is consistently ignored develops what psychologists call a dismissive or anxious attachment style, a fundamental orientation toward relationships that was shaped by what early relationships taught them. And what those early relationships taught them was one of two things. Either people are not reliably there, so I won't need them, or I must work very hard to be noticed because my natural presence isn't enough. Both of those lessons travel. Both of them show up in adulthood in ways the person often doesn't recognize as connected to what happened when they were small. The first kind, the one who learned not to need anyone, becomes the adult who is fiercely independent, almost pathologically self-sufficient, who handles everything alone, who never asks for help, who appears completely capable and quietly wonders why closeness feels so uncomfortable, why intimacy feels like standing too close to something they can't quite trust. They didn't choose this. Their nervous system chose it for them, long before they had words for it. The second kind, the one who learned their natural presence wasn't enough, becomes the adult who works, who achieves, who performs, who finds themselves in relationships and workplaces constantly scanning for signs of approval or disapproval, constantly measuring their worth against how much they are noticed, how much they are valued, how much space they are allowed to take up. They didn't develop this pattern from ambition. They developed it from a child's desperate attempt to be seen. And here's the part that nobody talks about. The ignored child doesn't just learn that they aren't important. They learn that their emotions aren't important. When you grow up in an environment where your feelings are consistently met with silence or indifference, where you cry and nothing changes, where you're excited and nobody mirrors it, where you're afraid and nobody comes, you don't just feel alone in those moments. You absorb a belief, the belief that your inner world is not worth responding to, that what you feel is not significant enough to matter to another person. That belief doesn't stay in childhood. It becomes the foundation of how the adult relates to their own emotions. It shows up as difficulty identifying what they feel, because they learned early to not pay too much attention to feelings that never went anywhere. It shows up as minimizing their own pain. It wasn't that bad. Other people had it worse. Because their nervous system was trained to dismiss exactly what they're now dismissing. It shows up as a strange discomfort when someone actually does respond to them with care, because care feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things can feel dangerous. Research from the field of developmental psychology consistently shows that emotional neglect, even in the absence of any other form of abuse, is one of the most significant predictors of adult mental health struggles. Not because the ignored child was damaged beyond repair, but because they were shaped by an absence. And absences are invisible. They don't leave the kind of evidence that anyone can point to later, which means the ignored child often grows up not knowing that anything happened to them at all. They just know something feels different, something feels harder, something feels missing, and they cannot name what. That namelessness is its own kind of weight. Let's be honest about something. If you grew up being ignored, there is a very good chance you have spent years not recognizing it as something that happened to you, because nothing happened. That's precisely the point. The ignored child wasn't hit. They weren't screamed at. They weren't told they were worthless. They were simply not responded to. And in the absence of a dramatic story, it can be very difficult to give yourself permission to say, "That affected me. That was something. That left a mark." But it was something. The developmental science is unambiguous on this. A child requires consistent, attuned emotional response to develop a healthy sense of self, a stable nervous system, and a secure relationship with other people. When that response is absent consistently over time, the child's development is affected quietly, invisibly, profoundly. Now here's what's fascinating, and this matters because this is where the story doesn't end where you might expect it to. The brain that developed under conditions of neglect is not a broken brain. It is an adapted brain. Every pattern the ignored child developed, the self-sufficiency, the hypervigilance to others' moods, the minimizing, the achieving, the discomfort with care, was a solution. A child's brilliant, resourceful, under the circumstances completely reasonable solution to an environment that wasn't giving them what they needed. The problem isn't that they developed these patterns. The problem is that the patterns kept running long after the environment changed. The nervous system didn't get the update. It kept solving a problem that no longer exists, using strategies that worked at 7 and caused pain at 35. And here is the most important thing this video can say. That can change. Not instantly, not easily, but it can change. Because the brain, even the brain shaped by neglect, even the brain that learned early that it wasn't worth responding to, retains the capacity to learn something new. Psychologists call this earned security. The process by which an adult, through consistent experience of being seen, heard, and responded to, whether in therapy, in safe relationships, or through developing a new relationship with their own inner world, gradually updates what their nervous system believes is possible. The ignored child became very good at surviving in a world where they didn't matter. What they are learning now, slowly, imperfectly, and with more courage than anyone gives them credit for, is what it feels like to be in a world where they do. To anyone watching this who recognizes themselves in what was just described, the child who was in the room and somehow not in the room, I want to say something directly to you. What happened to you was real. The absence was real. The marks it left are real. And you have been carrying them with a kind of quiet endurance that most people will never understand because most people never had to develop it. You were not too much. You were not too little. You were a child who needed to be seen. And the failure to see you was never, not once, a reflection of your worth. You were always worth seeing. Subscribe to Brain Decoded for more psychology that puts words to things you've been carrying without them. And if this video reached someone you love, the person in the room who is never quite in the room, share it with them. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for someone is let them know they've been seen.